And moving to the third aspect here on the urban debate, the big challenge for India, and not just about the refugee challenge that we were talking about, but also the fact that Taliban seems to be gaining support, not just from Pakistan, who's their age-old friend, but also Russia and China. And there are repeated comments being made by these other two big powers, big superpowers, indicating their support to the Taliban. One is inviting them for talks to be held. The other is saying that we already know that they're going to do the right thing, form an inclusive government. These are the countries who've actually even left people back home, back in their embassies in Afghanistan because they feel it's safe, and they probably are right because they've struck these pacts with a group like the Taliban. Now, this extended troika, not just Pakistan and terror backing Pakistan, but also its friend China and also Russia backing Taliban. What does it mean for us? Does it add to our challenge? Does it make it tricky for us to design our own policy towards Afghanistan and Taliban-led Afghanistan? Does it make it even more difficult for our security forces in terms of a terror threat and the terror channel? That's what I'm going to be talking about for the next 30 minutes. Let's say good evening to the panelists joining me right now on this conversation. Leela Ponnappa, former diplomat and Deputy National Security Advisor. Professor Amitabh Mattu, Professor of International Relations at JNU and Melbourne University. M.K. Bhadrakumar, former diplomat, also joining us this evening. And Deep Pal, visiting fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Lisa Curtis, Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, joining me this evening. Thank you so much to all of you. Leela Ponnappa, let me start off with you. How does India begin to design its policy, keeping in mind that two of these biggest countries, along with Pakistan, are now beginning to favor Taliban already?
I think starting point and really the basic point will have to be what would work in India's interests. And a question that I think the government has to ask itself is whether the equations or the absence of them, the last time that the Taliban was in power in Afghanistan, worked in India's interests. Right now, you covered the immediate humanitarian problem of the rush to leave Afghanistan and the inevitable refugee situation that will develop in many countries, including ours, that needs attention. So you have to have some kind of a working relationship if we are to get all our nationals out. Thereafter, India will have to carefully see how and whether the nature of contacts, if any, that it maintains with the government that evolves. Right now, it is the Taliban that has ousted the Ashraf Ghani government, but a new government is yet to take over, and the dimensions of that are still not clear. At the same time, dialogue is necessary. We may not necessarily like the nature of the regime, but then that's true of so many of our relations with other countries. They are not similar to us, but we deal with them. Having said that, I think we should also be very mindful of the fact that Russia, China, and certainly starting with Pakistan, are going to try to play a very major role in sustaining what has happened. There's no question that Pakistan, as it did in the 90s, is the force, the mentor, the patron of the Taliban. And the fact that even though the Taliban has made conciliatory statements, whether it is about the role of women in Afghan society, whether it is about Kashmir being an India-Pakistan bilateral issue, and so on, let us not forget that an intrinsic part of the Taliban hierarchy is a very senior member of the Haqqani network in Pakistan. And I think that speaks for itself, because it is some of these operatives who have attacked Indian assets in Afghanistan. So yes, we have to be very mindful of the likelihood of a security threat and try to take whatever steps are possible through such engagement as is considered necessary. And I'm deliberately being vague because the dimensions of what's evolving in Kabul are still not clear. So it's a very tricky situation. I mean, people recollect the Great Game and so on, where Russia was trying to make its eastward move into India and the British tried to formulate something. But here you have something very much more immediate with China, Pakistan, and you haven't mentioned Iran.
Yes.
Iran is going to be a major player in this as well. Meanwhile, the Gulf countries, it's interesting that while the three have not closed down their embassies, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have evacuated. Turkey has been very supportive, I would say, of it. And a very telling comment that Turkey's contacts with the military dimension of the Taliban are through Pakistan. This is an official statement. The political contact is at Qatar, but the military contact is through Pakistan. So you're going to get all these players trying to control the situation, direct the situation, but ultimately the net game has to be what becomes sustainable in Afghanistan.
Yes.
I don't have a crystal ball. There's no way of knowing how it will emerge. But I think these are some of the dimensions that have to be kept in view, while mindful that many of India's projects have worked for the benefit at the grassroots of the people of Afghanistan.
Oh, yes, of course. And thank you for actually laying out all of those aspects, sets the tone for this conversation. So, Ambassador Badra Kumar, to you then, to carry this conversation forward. How does India tackle this? Should we now accept the reality that at some point we will have to have official conversations with the Taliban?
No, that is not a choice. I think it is inevitable. At what point we do is only the question that we need to discuss. My assessment, my recommendation would be in a situation such as this, with all these imponderables and ifs and buts which have been mentioned here now by the previous participant, the approach that we will take eventually, and which I think should be sooner than later, should be what we adopted with regard to the Mujahideen groups in the early 1990s, what Narasimha Rao took at that time, the decision that despite the fact that these Peshawar 7 were in command and that they were all brought up in the playpen of the ISI, and for long years, for a decade, they were handled only by the CIA and the ISI, and they were funded by the sheikhs, Wahhabi groups included. Nonetheless, we must have conversation with them. And that conversation was a very simple conversation, which is to say that whoever forms the government in Afghanistan, that is for the people of Afghanistan to decide. And historically, civilizationally, there is a relationship between the two peoples. And therefore, we offer friendship, a hand of friendship and cooperation. Tell us what we can do for you, for your country's reconstruction, and convey our goodwill and our good intentions. Now, this is a kind of conversation. I undertook this conversation, incidentally, on behalf of India at that point in time. And the resistance was very considerable at that time, as we can see even today in India. Unfortunately, we know America better than our neighbors. Often I experience this. Countries like Afghanistan are so terribly important for India's national security. But the narratives that have come up in our country are not at all helpful. And in the early 90s, we felt the same problem. We had to organize at that time a seminar in the India International Center with the goodwill of a professor in the JNU to kind of sensitize the strategic community and the media why there is an imperative need to have a conversation with the Afghan Mujahideen, people like Rasul Sayaf, Wahhabi, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and so on. So, this is a replay as far as I can see, because the inevitability of the Taliban mainstreaming is very much there is a writing on the wall.
Yep.
Now, the fine touches to it is what we are discussing. If Lavrov is to be believed today, conversations are going on. And if the State Department spokesman is to be believed, constructive conversation talks are going on between the United States and the Taliban in Kabul and in Doha. So we can see, that things are moving in terms of a political arrangement to shift to the transition stage, and whereafter peace process will continue into a new era. So I see it that way. And I think final point is this. I think it was premature on our part to have closed down the mission. That is my feeling. This is the final point I want to make. And if I were in any position in the government, I would have recommended against it. Because this is a time, it's vitally important that India is there. An embassy is the ears and the eyes of the country. And every day there are political stirrings going on. And these people are in the city, in the streets, everywhere. And this is a wonderful time, in fact, to turn a new page. And India should have been there.
Okay, let me bring in Lisa Curtis as well on this. What is your view? The fact that US obviously in many ways, without directly saying it, has already held dialogues with Taliban, has left the country to them and gotten out. China, Russia all seem to be on their way to legitimizing and recognizing Taliban. So where does that leave India?
Well, of course, Pakistan, China, Russia, they've already recognized the Taliban. They saw no need to condition their recognition on Taliban respect for human rights or relationships with terrorists. That's not really surprising. The US, though, our diplomatic recognition means something, and we should certainly be withholding it until we know the kind of Taliban that we're dealing with. It's very unclear. They're saying some of the right things. They're saying that women are welcome back into government. However, we're hearing other different stories on the ground, stories of girls not being allowed to go to school, women not being allowed to go to work, even some, very brutal activities of demanding young girls to be married off to Taliban fighters. So it's really still too early to judge what we're dealing with here. And we all know the history, the background, the Pakistani support, the ISI support for the Taliban, the influence of the Haqqani Network, which is a foreign terrorist organization in the United States. So really, we really cannot, if we judge by everything we've always known about this organization, I think we should be extremely skeptical about what is happening. And even though the US is talking with the Taliban in Doha, my hope is that any official recognition, there would be some very strict conditions on that, and that it would not happen quickly, that we would judge the Taliban by their actions on the ground, not merely the words that they're saying.
Yeah, well, I would say that if anything, the Taliban in the last 20 years have just gotten smarter, more organized, more tech savvy, and have also learned the political language. But just like many political parties across the world, they may say all the right sounding words ahead of getting the power. But once they get the power that gets recognized by everybody, then they're going to do what they believe in. And I don't think there is any doubt in what they believe in. Up until a month ago, Deepal, reports were still coming out of their brutality, especially against women.
Right, Tanvi, thank you for having me. Absolutely. I don't think there is any doubt about whether the Taliban have moved greatly away from what we saw the last time in the 1990s. I mean, if you listen to them talking, they are talking about having a government that follows the Sharia law. They are talking about allowing things to go on as they were supposed to, but obviously within the confines of Sharia law. So there is definitely no kind of an assumption that it is going to be a complete break from the Taliban that we saw. And it is important to understand that all the supporters of the various states, if you talk about China or Russia or Iran or anyone else that we have seen that have backed the Taliban's journey till here, they are also holding on any kind of a word on what the way forward will be till the Taliban themselves decide on what kind of a government they want to be. If you look at a statement that has come out from China after the conversation between the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, along with the foreign ministers of China and Russia, it talks about how China expects the Taliban to denounce extremism as well as have an inclusive government, right? So these are very specific and definite concerns. And as Lisa was also mentioning, these are concerns that do exist around the world. What it means for women, what it means for their education, the fact that women in the last 2 decades have, in fact, made a space for themselves in public life in Afghanistan. There are judges who, as we have read and heard, they are in hiding, right? Women judges that are in hiding. There are women sports people, musicians, and no one really knows what is going to happen to them. And one of the things that possibly this new Taliban, which has learned the political language, which has learned political messaging, which at least at the outset or in complete view of world cameras does not seem to be behaving the way we had seen them behave in the 1990s. The repression, when it comes, it will not be as visible. It will not be open to the world public for them to see. It will happen, possibly creep in silently, as we are hearing, not from Kabul, but from parts of Afghanistan, which have been taken over by the Taliban earlier in the month or a couple of weeks ago. That is where these reports are already beginning to come in. The Taliban asking women to limit themselves as far as their public interactions or their role in public life is concerned. So that is something that we'll have to watch very, very carefully.
Yeah, I mean, and I hope nobody, actually falls for this kind of a narrative building that they're doing. So in the interiors, and you're right, Deep, in the interiors, there are reports. We've spoken to people whose families are there outside of Kabul, who are already talking about the horror stories. But what is it that Taliban is doing? We've not got any visuals coming out of the Kabul airport like they did yesterday. We got visuals of Taliban soldiers enjoying and having a good time in the amusement park, in the gym, trying to draw this picture of, how they are normal and like everybody else. Visuals from the Kabul city where life is normal with women who are roaming outside. That they went to one of the news networks there and they said, okay, you can continue with your work, put your women back on field. Now, this is the kind of messaging that can happen. But I don't think it should fool anybody of who they are and what they believe in, because they continue to reiterate, Professor Mattu, that any, whatever it is in terms of work, education, or any other policy will be within their framework and will be as per the Sharia law, which is open to interpretation, however Taliban wants to interpret it. Professor, okay, we seem to have lost that line with Professor Mattu. I'm going to take that point across to Leela Ponnappa.
Well, you're entirely right. And even with the best of intentions, there are going to be an immense number of contradictions between what is said, what is done, and what happens perhaps in a major city and in the background. But I think in terms of decision-making and policy, I go back to the initial question. Between 96 and 2001, certainly for India, when we did not have official contacts with the then regime, the Taliban regime in Kabul, did it work for India's interests? Were there lines of communication to deal with situations, problems that might occur? And I think the answer would have to be no. Let's assume a worst case. Let's say all the worst fears about the Taliban come true, and that even they sort of brush aside their earlier remarks and it goes back to the kind of period that it was between 96 and 2001. That's when India really has to face the very difficult choice of, here is a regime which we think is totally contradictory to our values as a nation, yet it is vital to our security. What is the nature of the contact we have? Now, I think diplomacy comes up with sometimes creative solutions. You might call it a trade center, you might call it working contacts, you might call it full diplomatic recognition, you might say consular relations, etc., etc. But I think there is no choice, and I entirely agree with Ambassador Badra Kumar on this point. So we will have to deal with the reality you cannot, might not like the reality, but you have to deal with it.
Okay.
And since there are Indian nationals involved, there are Indian assets involved, and there are serious Indian security interests involved, this is something where you have to bite the bullet.
Yes, in fact, the serious security interest involved, and let me take that point to Ambassador Badra Kumar, because when we have conversations with them or build whatever connections with them, we have to, obviously, we know that they are very closely linked to Pakistan. The terror groups in Pakistan is effectively backed by Pakistan. How will we balance that? How will we ensure that all the terror factories from Pakistan don't simply transfer to Afghanistan or get added in Afghanistan?
You know, the comparison with the 90s is understandable, unsurprising, but we also have to factor in that there's an entirely different environment existing today. One is, as Ambassador Ponnappa said, that it's very significant, and I think it is hardly noticed even by well-informed Indians, that amongst the embassies which have closed down, there is Saudi and Emirati. Now, why is this important? I'm sure she flagged it to draw our attention that this is a very important pointer. In the 1990s, the Taliban was the progeny of Pakistan, of the United States, and the sheikhs in the Persian Gulf region, Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And we know for a fact that Prince Turki used to be in and out of Afghanistan. And at that time, this movement was created for several purposes. One is in terms of laying down an oil pipeline for American oil companies to stabilize Afghanistan for that reason. And as far as the Saudis and Emiratis are concerned, to settle their ancient rivalry with Iran. And therefore, a very strong dose of Wahhabism was injected into the Taliban. And many of their actions at that point in time are to be reviewed closely today. For example, the killing of the 11 Iranian diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif. It was put on the Taliban. And now, after probing deep into that, Iran has understood that Taliban was used as a tool, as an instrument by others who needed to provoke Iran into attacking Afghanistan. So you see these excesses which took place, etc., took place in a certain context. And also in a context where the Taliban was also different. It was completely in the grip of the Pakistanis. Now, what do we find here? They have diversified relations today with other countries, with internationally. I think almost all Western agencies have been talking to them. Americans, of course, have been talking at different levels, political, diplomatic, and intelligence level. So you see, the Taliban has got a cosmopolitan outlook today. That is one thing, the exposure outside. They've been visiting foreign capitals, and ISI officers are not escorting them wherever they go. And I think it's universally accepted today that the kind of simplistic notion that we have in India, that they are tied to the apron strings of the Pakistani security and defense establishment, is not warranted anymore. In the sense that Pakistan also has genuinely certain difficulties in getting things done through them, by them.
Are you saying, Ambassador Badra Kumar, they're not going to tolerate any kind of terror factories from Pakistan on their soil?
Now, I'm coming to that. I'm very much coming to that. How does it suit Pakistan today? You have heard of the terror financing process which is going on today. Pakistan is also under very close scrutiny. And do you think it suits China if terror factories move into Afghanistan? What is China's concern? In India, we have this notion that whatever China does after breakfast in the morning is about India. No, far from it. Their first concern, primary concern over Afghanistan is in terms of Xinjiang's security. And what is Russia's? Chechnya, Northern Caucasus. Because they've gone through hell and they don't want a replay of that. Iran. There are terror groups which are operating in Afghanistan during the American occupation, which were working towards subverting Iran. Wahhabi groups financed by Saudi Arabia. And in fact, one of their group's leaders was killed by the Taliban as a confidence-building measure for Iran on the 8th of August So you see, unless you go into the fine print, you are not going to be able to understand. You will have these broad strokes of how they are going to deal with the women and all the rest of it. Today's press conference in the capital city, and if you know Afghanistan and the Afghan temperament, they take their word very seriously because they are saying this in front of their countrymen. And for a person, it's a terribly important thing. And in the capital city, what do they say about women? And they can go back to work. They can go back and study. And they are announced a general amnesty for all those people who were in Ghani's government. Now, you have to look at these details. And unless you know these details, you will use cliches.
Ambassador Bhadrakumar, may I also say, though, that we have spoken to people who have confirmed to us that Taliban soldiers are actually going home to home, taking down details of women who have been working and marking those homes as well. Now, we can choose to only see one side of it, which is their so-called PR machinery and statements that are issuing to gain the backing of the world right now. But how are we to confirm what's happening on ground? Who's controlling the stories which are coming out of Kabul? Only one entity, which is the Taliban.
No, nobody's going to come and convince you. You are going to be the loser. You can refuse to be convinced and you will be the loser. Because if China engages Afghanistan, and if Russia engages and Iran engages, Central Asian states engages, and Turkey and the Gulf Arab countries and so on, well, by all means, go ahead and stay back. How does it benefit India's interests? Doesn't Saudi Arabia have this problem of women? And it's one of the closest allies of the United States. So what are we talking about?
Yes, you are correct. You're absolutely right. This is the reality of the world today, of geopolitics and diplomacy. Unfortunately, that it doesn't matter what happens to women's rights in any country in this world right now. It's each to his own. Lisa Curtis, it is each to his own. And because 5 other of the biggest superpowers have kept their own interests in mind and abandoned the people of Afghanistan, so should everybody else.
The United States has done what is in best interest.
Ambassador, if you may allow me to just take that point across to other panelists. Lisa Curtis.
Yes, of course we have to care how the Taliban is going to treat the Afghan population and whether or not they're going to rule in a different way than they did in the 1990s. And I think that the UN has a role to play here. We're already hearing that the UN is investigating all these reports of Taliban atrocities against Afghan civilians. And I think this will matter, and this is important. And again, we need to look at what the Taliban is doing on the ground and, look at ask the people who are still there, get the firsthand reports about what's going on. Because, even though Russia and China and Pakistan, well, look, we had no doubt Pakistan was going to recognize the Taliban. Pakistan supports the Taliban. But when it comes to Russia and China, the only thing they care about are their own counterterrorism interests. So they will deal with the Taliban to make sure that the Taliban does something about the terrorists that directly threaten their countries. And they're just going to cover their own particular interests. We can't really count on Russia and China to be promoting human rights in Afghanistan. That's not going to happen. So I think it is important for the international community to get together, the US with its European allies who have like-minded values, India who has like-minded values and has also been working with the women of Afghanistan, promoting democracy. India has done a lot on this front. And so we all have an interest in not seeing the country revert back to barbaric status, that we want to see as many as the gains possible that have been made over the last 20 years preserved. And that should be the focus of the international community. So what if China and Russia and Pakistan want to, jump in there and try to make their deals with the Taliban? That doesn't mean the rest of the civilized international community who cares about human rights, how human beings are going to be treated in that country, how we need to act.
Yes, and I just want to make one thing clear. I am not here advocating that we don't talk to Taliban. There may be a very clear view that others may have that we don't absolutely not indulge with Taliban. But the simple point here, Deep, is that we can't fall for the narrative that they're putting out until we actually see the reality on ground and then decide what our policy needs to be. We can't take it for granted that they will not, go back to having some kind of terror ploys until we actually see any proof.
Right.
Yes,
so
Ambassador Ponnappa, coming to you next.
Right. Let me take that in a couple of steps, Tanvi. So first is absolutely, I agree with what others have said about eventually having to speak to the Taliban. Right. When we look at Afghanistan, it is continuing to be where it is. India is continuing to be where it is, and we are going to be countries that are geographically close. You will need to speak to whoever is in charge there, which, as we know now, is the Taliban. So it's a matter of time. It's a matter of how we figure out who to speak with, what to speak about, and where that conversation goes, who does that conversation, and so on. That is one. Part two is as far as the narratives that are being created, the discourses that are being spun, right? Now, if you remember on the 15th of August, as we first heard that the Taliban was at Kabul's door, we heard voices coming out of Doha, the Taliban's Doha office, which said that, that we have reached Kabul, but we are not going to go in. Soon after, there were reports, we were speaking to people in Kabul who were saying that the Taliban is inside Kabul. So the story from Doha changed, which said that, yes, the Taliban is in Kabul, but they're there to provide security. And as time went on, these were the same people who then we found making a list of people, of eminent people or people that the Taliban wanted to keep an eye on, making lists of their names. And eventually, by nightfall, we saw these same Taliban reach Ahmed Ghani's office in the presidential palace. So there is obviously a gap between what the clean, clear, sanitized version that's coming out of Doha and what is happening on ground in Afghanistan, in Kabul, and definitely beyond Kabul in the places where TV cameras or journalists don't really manage to go. So that's something to remember, right? Now, having said all of that, I also want to emphasize that it will not be as easy for either Pakistan or the Taliban to use Afghanistan's ground for terror activities against India or someone else, because while the US may have left, there are a number of other bigger countries that have thrown their lot behind the Taliban, given it some kind of legitimacy that has gotten them till here. And one of the major reasons why they have managed to come till here is because, you see, they look like any other political outfit in many ways. To lose that would be a problem, because that again brings them in confrontation with a number of powers. So we know Amrullah Saleh earlier today declared himself as taking over as the president of Afghanistan. He says that according to the constitution of Afghanistan, the first vice president becomes the president, right? He's in the northern part of the country. He says he's going to lead the opposition to the Taliban. Now, the Taliban obviously do not want to lose supporters at this point. So it's early days. We'll have to wait and watch, even see what form a Taliban government in Afghanistan takes. But I would say that if we think that it's again going to be business as usual, as we saw in 1996 from day one, I think it's a little too early to think of it that way.
Okay, 25 years later, how different will it be is what all of us will be watching out for. My apologies, Ambassador Ponnappa, I'm completely out of time, so I will have to wrap up this one, but hopefully have all of you again for another round of conversation as we see how things progress in Afghanistan, how Taliban really handles that, what kind of government formation do they do? Do they actually listen to the international call of having an inclusive government? And what does that really mean for the people of Afghanistan? But more importantly, we will also be closely looking out for how does India handle it? First up, of course, is to get our own citizens back with safety. Then will be to design a strategy of how to tackle this diplomatically with the Taliban regime now in control in Afghanistan, with countries like Pakistan, China and Russia and Turkey already very openly backing this regime. It's going to be a tricky path, but I'm sure with all the expertise available, the government too will design a strategy soon as it closely monitors what happens in Doha and, of course, in Afghanistan. Thank you so much for joining us on this conversation.
One from Indian government to support us, especially in visa terms. If it's possible to start a classes or a diploma or a course for just minimum for 1 year or maximum anything from government, that will be good.